Welcome to Crossroad Connection. We're speaking out for those left unheard. My name is David Schuring. I want to welcome you to another exciting program as we seek to speak out for people that are in need, and we seek to evaluate ways in which the church can be more effective in its mission. And for that, today I have in the studio with me today Reverend Mark Stevenson. Welcome, Mark, back to the program.
Thank you. It's good to be here again. Mark
is the Director of Disability Concerns, a ministry of the Christian Reformed Church. And you've become a regular on this program, haven't you?
Yeah, a few times already. I appreciate your invitations.
Well, we appreciate you coming here. I've learned so much, and at first people might not necessarily see a connection between someone working with people with disabilities and people working with prisoners, but over the years we've found a tremendous amount of intersection, haven't we?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
And so we have seen that in the same way that churches need to be more welcoming for people with disabilities, they need to be more welcoming for people who were formerly incarcerated.
Sure.
We see that people who are incarcerated, the majority of them suffer from some form of disability, whether it's FAS or mental illness of some sort.
Right.
Lots and lots of connections, huh?
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah.
Now today, you suggested a topic that I'm finding intriguing and looking forward to talking about, and that is how society creates disabilities. Did I word that correctly?
Yeah, I that's okay. That's an okay wording. Yes.
How society develops disabilities. Now, I think my first thoughts go to, when thinking of disability, something that happens to an individual.
Right.
Perhaps they're born with something, or perhaps they incur an accident of some sort and are disabled.
Right.
I haven't thought about the creation of disabilities at a societal level. What are we talking about here?
Sure. It's really good to think in terms of not only the person, but also our response as a society to that person, to the person's limitations. A good definition isn't quite the right word, but a good description of disability is that it's intellectual, sensory, emotional, or physical impairment which in interaction with various barriers may hinder someone's full and effective participation in society or the church.
Let me make sure I have this straight now. Maybe you have to repeat that for us.
Sure.
It's the disability not on its own in isolation, but it's an interaction with whatever barriers that society is consciously or unconsciously providing.
Right.
Get that right?
It's the barriers part, which is the what I mean by the creation of disability. So, for example, most folks didn't think 100 years ago about building ramps onto buildings. But what that did was anybody who used a wheelchair would not have access to the building. Right? So,
or except for in a very clumsy way.
Well, yeah, okay, yeah, or that have to be carried in, I mean, it'd be very awkward and frightening. I've talked to people who have been carried in their wheelchairs, and they say, "Oh, it's a terrible, frightening experience. You'd never want to have to go through that."
Right.
So, and that's just one simple example. But then when we start doing that in a variety of other ways, then we erect barriers to people's participation. Because what we do as a society is we think in terms of, well, these are the normal, typical abilities, and so we create we call it a built environment, which includes not just architecture, but it includes our communications and so on. We gear all that for people with typical abilities. And suddenly the folks who are somehow limited in one area or another, we exclude them.
So we are, in essence, creating a disability. That's a fascinating thought, because if the ramp is there, going back to that example, the disability does not exist in a sense of hindering them from participation.
Right, exactly. Think about a man that I know, Sam Gabue, is the director of the Ecumenical Disability Advocates Network. He lives in Nairobi. He lives with a disability himself. He's blind. And I heard him speak one time, and he gave this example. He said, imagine a village in which everybody, from babies all the way through the older adults, all used wheelchairs. Nobody could walk. What would the built environment look like in a society like that? Well, first of all, there'd be no chairs. Doors would all be short. Bathrooms be constructed in a certain way. So you imagine then suddenly, as a person who can walk, to come into a village that's built exclusively for people who use wheelchairs, and you'd find yourself the disabled person, because there are all these barriers to your participation in that society.
So let's say, for example, that a bizarre example comes to mind.
Okay.
And I don't know if it makes the point, but you and I both wear glasses.
Yep.
And let's say we enter into a particular building that says wearing glasses is a violation of the fire code.
Oh, yeah, right.
So they take away our glasses. Suddenly, we are disabled.
Yeah. Right.
This
right.
is what's
Right, cool.
this is
Yeah,
this is
sure.
the, this is the perspective you're trying to get.
Yeah, right. I'd be in trouble if I couldn't wear my glasses.
Oh,
so,
I couldn't
yeah.
walk across the street.
Right. Right. Yeah. Yeah.
But so you can create disability.
Usually it's unconscious, but we erect barriers. There are architectural barriers, bathrooms, steps, that kind of thing. But there's also communication barriers. So, for example, a church projects this wonderful video that displays text and words on the screen,
Right.
and has this great music and pictures, and everybody who watches it is moved, and the person who's blind, all they do is they hear the music, and they have no idea why everybody else is so moved by this presentation.
What's the solution right there?
Well, there needs to be narration.
Ah. Okay.
Or at least in advance of the projection of this video, somebody needs to go to the person who can't see and say, this video that we're projecting today has no narration, so how about if we have somebody sit with you and give you a description of it
Or maybe
what's
use
going on.
for the hearing impaired, you have an earphone on and kind of talking through it.
Yeah, there are electronic solutions to that, right? And there's this thing called closed video description or closed video descriptor, so that some videos are made that way, so that they automatically.
Almost like an SAP captioning on a television program.
Right,
Yeah.
right. But instead of words
Yes.
appearing on the screen,
Got it.
it's an audio description
Right.
going into the ear.
Yes.
So yeah.
Now, to what extent do we not think of these things unless we ourselves are involved or a loved one with us?
Right. That's a great question. It's so important to involve people with disabilities in leadership, because if you don't, you miss it. You'll miss it.
You'll miss it.
Absolutely.
I mean, that's why society misses it.
Right.
And creates these problems
Right.
because there's nobody there. I was
Right.
preaching in a church a couple of weeks ago, a large, wonderful church here in West Michigan. But I got a knee thing,
Okay.
And I think it's getting worse as I get
Mhm.
older. But, my knees can be weak and get a little bit wobbly. And I tell people they're old football injuries. So if you look at me, I never played football. But, some kind of sports injury. That sounds pretty
Yeah,
cool.
if you look at you, you're not getting older either.
That's right. But anyway, I was preaching at this church, and I was just kind of having a bad day with my knees. And there's stairs that go up. You climb up
Right.
those stairs, and I'm behind the pulpit. And about 25 minutes into my sermon, my knees are getting wobbly.
Oh, yeah.
And it's like, boy, I wish I had a stool to sit on. I'd probably look kind of cool. Have a bar stool there, something like
Yeah,
that.
that'd be okay.
But what I did is I walked over to there was a table there, like the communion table. I just kind of leaned on it for a couple
Oh, yeah.
minutes,
Yeah.
and while I was chatting with the folks, and then
Sure.
I got back to it, right?
Right.
And then at the end of the message, I felt a little wobbly going down the stairs. Now, this is not a big deal. I'm a healthy guy and all that kind of stuff.
Right.
But that situation, that experience, made me think, what about a person in a wheelchair? They can't walk at all, but they're great communicators.
Mm-hmm.
Now, what would it be like for them to come preach at that kind of average church where there's steps up? Now, I know there's symbolism of that. You're climbing up to the pulpit and so forth, but what does that mean for them? I mean,
Let me give you an example.
So do they have to sit there and put them up on the with a
Let
crane?
me give you a very specific example of that. I have a friend who's a public speaker, and he uses a wheelchair, and he's very effective. He's written a wonderful book. He went to this church, and they didn't have steps, and it's a brand new building,
Brand new.
brand new.
So they
And
should have thought of it.
what happened was he was waiting for a couple guys to come and carry him up the steps. And while he was waiting, he said, the pastor's wife came up to him and just started chatting and said, "Hey, I'm sorry we don't have a ramp here. Our old building had a ramp, but it didn't make for a nice balanced look in front. And we had a loophole in our state that we didn't have to put a ramp up to the pulpit area. And we figured nobody ever uses a wheelchair anyway who goes to the pulpit area, so why put in the ramp? Because it doesn't look good. So sorry about that."
This just sounds terrible at a number of levels.
Yeah.
You know, so,
Yeah.
so they're almost proud of themselves of finding a loophole so they can keep the pulpit area looking nice.
Yeah. Yeah. And the thing is that one can build pulpit areas with very nice looking ramps, and I've seen
Yes.
them. I've seen them.
Well, you know it's got to be possible.
Of course. But
But that goes back to what I had said a couple minutes ago. You know, unless you personally experience it or something, you don't think about it very,
exactly.
very. You know, I mean, I had never until that 2 weeks ago ever thought about the accessibility of a pulpit.
Oh, yeah, right.
It
Right.
never crossed my mind.
No, right.
You know,
right,
and
sure.
and so what you're saying, this happens in 1,000 different ways, and unless you have people in leadership that are the whistleblowers or the idea people, it just doesn't happen.
Yeah, I wouldn't call them
people in
whistleblowers, but
or,
yeah, right.
or people in
Getting
leadership
ideas,
who
yeah.
have children or people who are disabled.
Oh, yeah.
Because then you are alert to it.
Let me give you an example. Borculo Christian Reformed Church has an old church building. I don't know how old, 100 years old or more. And they decided that they were going to renovate. A woman who goes to that church, Pat, uses a wheelchair, and her father was on the building committee. And he made sure that Pat could use everything well as they went about the construction process. And they did a beautiful job with renewing their facility, this old building. Some churches try to find, okay, so we got to meet code, so we'll build the cheapest possible lift that we can, but they're difficult to use. You have to use this little screen thing. You got to pull it across, and it would be hard for anybody to use independently. But they said, no, we are going to do this right because this is the right thing to do. And so it can be done.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, it's what the church is about, right? We need to be reaching out to the less fortunate not because we, take pity on them, but because we need them in our midst. Am I right?
Well, that's right.
We need their gifts. We need their input. We need their voices to be what the church needs to be. So we shouldn't think like, oh boy, we're spending this money on these poor folks or whatever like that, or feel guilty about it, to do it out of guilt, right?
Right.
But we should be doing it out of an eagerness to embrace and to welcome.
Right. Yeah, okay, so each human being is made in the image of God. So should we or should we not do what we can to make our church buildings and our fellowships as welcoming to people who bear the image of God? Should we or should we not do that? Well, the answer is obvious, I think. We should. That's the right thing to do. And we do that by making sure that our buildings and our communication and most of all our attitudes give that welcome for the folks who do things differently than most of us do. And that's true not just in terms of disability. That's true in terms of, cultural differences. It's true in terms of male and female, young and old, all those things. If we're going to embrace this beauty of this body of Christ that the Apostle Paul pictures in Revelation, I think it's 7, of this great multitude from every tribe and tongue and nation, it's this picture of this wonderful diversity of God's people. And if we're serious about being like that now, then we need to think about this diversity as we go about our being church.
Well, I think that it could not be expressed better. And Mark, I just really appreciate you and the work that you are doing as you are waking the church up to these new possibilities for welcoming and for receiving others and making use of the gifts of God's people. When you talked about the idea of how society creates disabilities, you sort of had me baffled there. How can that be? But after this conversation, you can definitely see how that can happen, and it is happening.
Sure.
And now we need to, as a church, take those situations and redeem them, improve them, and do a lot better so that we can be welcoming.
Yeah. Oh, it's a delight to talk about it. Thanks for inviting me.
Yes, thanks once again for being here, and I'm sure you'll be back, so we'll look forward to that next time.
Great.
And thank you for joining us for this edition of Crossroad Connection. We've been talking with Mark Stevenson, who is a pastor and the Director of Disability Concerns, and we hope that you've enjoyed the program, and we hope that you have grown and maybe have some ideas for your church and how it can be more welcoming to prisoners, to people with disabilities, to people in need. We need them all in order to be the body of Christ. We hope to see you again right here next week.